Hey guys, tonight we begin with the smell of lye soap and wet wool, drifting across a village too poor for windows. The wind whistles through slats in the walls, cold enough to sting but not cold enough to keep from washing, because there's a bucket of water waiting, and someone has to be brave enough to touch it. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're tuning in from. What time is it where you are? This isn't the kind of history they wrapped in silk or carved into stone. It's the kind that lives in wooden tubs, in hands red from scrubbing, and in the quiet struggle to stay human when everything smells like manure and smoke. The fire flickers low, casting long shadows on the dirt floor. A child stirs beneath a scratchy blanket, and someone rises to pour out yesterday's water thick with grease and specks of ash before starting again. Because this is what it meant to care. To clean what could be cleaned, even if no one noticed. We won't be following a queen tonight. We won't be riding into battles or sitting in velvet chairs. Instead, we'll crouch beside mothers who wipe their children's faces with the corners of their aprons. We'll stand in doorways with fathers rinsing their hands in cold rain. We'll listen to the water drip, to the fire hiss, and to the small, nearly invisible rituals of survival, because hygiene, in this forgotten world, wasn't about beauty. It was about grit. It was about honor stitched into soap-stained sleeves, and with that, the basin waits, the wind holds its breath, and the story begins. They didn't call it soap, not the way we do now. To them, it was simply a mixture, something scoured together. From things no one wanted, ashes from the hearth, animal fat scraped from bones, water that had already gone cloudy. There was no scent to it, unless you count the way smoke clung to everything, and no softness, only sting. And yet, it mattered. The women who made it rarely smiled while they did. The work was slow, and the lye burned if you weren't careful. But there was quiet pride in the stirring, in the pouring, in the setting of the thick gray paste into a wooden mold lined with cloth. Something useful from waste. Something harsh that still helped. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. Imagine a peasant kitchen, low ceiling, one small window stuffed with waxed cloth, and a fire that never quite stayed in its place. A pot hangs over the coals, not for soup, but for soap. The ashes came from many fires, sifted through with fingers hardened by frost. The fat was saved from every slaughter, stinking even when fresh. And the water, poured slowly, was mixed, until the smell turned sharp enough to clear your nose. Lye, they called it. Dangerous if you got it wrong, but perfect if you were careful. The soap didn't foam. It scraped. It took skin with it sometimes. But to them, it was a miracle. A way to cut through grease. A way to show effort. A way to prove, even in mud and sweat, that they hadn't given up. Children weren't allowed near the process. Not because of fire, but because of failure. If one thing was added too soon, the mixture would curdle. Too little lye, and it was useless. Too much, and it would burn. The soapmaker's art was quiet and unforgiving, like so many things in peasant life, and when it was ready, they'd cut the block into smaller pieces. Some to be used right away. Some to be stored in muslin and hung from a beam, high enough that rats couldn't nibble it. No one hoarded it, but everyone respected it. Because in a world where washing was rare, soap was a kind of power. They used it where it mattered. Hands before meals, faces before mass, underarms before a feast. Not often, but enough. Sometimes neighbors traded soap. A wife who had too much might offer it to a mother who had just buried her child, the way people now offer flowers or cards. A silent offering, a quiet acknowledgement that grief clings, And maybe, just maybe, warm water and a scrub could wash away some of it. They didn't know about bacteria. They didn't say hygiene, but they knew what it meant to stink, and they knew the shame of it. A good bar of soap lasted weeks. A bad one fell apart after a few uses, leaving oily flakes in the basin. But either way, it wasn't the soap itself that mattered, it was the message it sent. We care. We tried. We are not animals. In towns, soap makers became known by name. Rarely praised, but always remembered. In the countryside, it was passed down grandmother to daughter, sister to sister. No recipes, just the memory of texture, the right heat, the moment when the mix thickened like porridge, then cooled like cream. There were accidents, of course. A child who touched the lye and screamed for hours. A woman who lost the use of 2 fingers. But the risk was worth it, because the world was already dirty, already cruel. Soap was one of the few ways they could push back. Some saved their soap for birth, for death, for holy days when they dared to hope someone might see them, really see them, and not just the dirt, because in the end, it wasn't about looking good. It was about feeling possible. A little less heavy, a little less forgotten, and so each lump of lye soap, harsh and homely, was a kind of offering not to a god, but to the idea that even in a world of fleas and frost, they could still be clean, not clean like nobles, not perfumed or powdered, but clean enough to carry on, clean enough to hold a child without shame, clean enough to eat from a wooden bowl and not feel the grease on your lips afterward, clean enough to bury someone you loved and know your hands did not betray them. And as the fire cracked and the basin cooled, they wiped their hands on their skirts and aprons and stepped back into the filth. Not because they didn't care, but because they did, because even in the dirtiest corners of history, someone was always trying to wash something clean. And that brings us to the next story, where filth wasn't failure, but insulation. Where staying unwashed might just have kept you alive. It's easy now to think of dirt as something shameful, a thing to be scrubbed away, banished from sight, swept up and sanitized. But there was a time when it was something else, something gentler. A shield. A second skin. A kind of warmth when nothing else would hold. In the depth of medieval winters, when snow blew sideways through the cracks in the walls and firewood was more memory than reality, dirt became more than filth. It became protection. There were homes where wind never stopped coming in, roofs patched with turf and mud, walls no thicker than a few planks, and floors that were the ground itself. And in that cold, where water froze in buckets and breath came out in clouds, no one thought first of cleanliness. They thought of staying alive. People layered everything: straw in their shoes, cloth on their heads, soot on their cheeks. And the dirt, thick as it was, stayed in place, not scrubbed, not scraped, because scrubbing brought chill, and chill brought death. There were mothers who bathed their children once in autumn, then swore not to do it again until spring. Not because they didn't love them, but because they did. A bath meant wet skin. Wet skin meant wind slipping under it. And wind in those houses was more predator than air. Blankets were too few, fires too small. But the body learned to hold what it had. Sweat mixed with dust, oil mixed with smoke, and in the folds of clothes, in the crooks of knees and elbows, grime settled in like a friend who stayed for the worst nights. They didn't say, "Don't wash," but they knew when not to, because they'd seen it. A child cleaned too well, too quickly, and wrapped in linens too thin. A fever followed. And after that, nothing. The old ones murmured warnings, soft words about the chill that snuck in through, pores about the ghost that rode steam from warm skin. Some believed the devil loved clean people best because they felt the cold more deeply. Others just trusted what they saw. The ones who stayed a little dirty, a little grimy, seemed to last. The winter more often than those who did in single quotes T.so. They wore their dirt like armor. Not proudly, not carelessly, but knowingly. They combed their hair, but didn't wash it. They dusted their hands, but didn't rinse them. A cloth might be dabbed to the forehead, but only dry, and in this strange way, filth was kindness. A way of telling the body, I will not put you through this again. I'll wait for the thaw.at night, when they lay on straw beds, wrapped in whatever they owned. The smell of life unwashed and heavy was familiar. The scent of survival, of shared burdens, of days that refused to kill them, and even though it clung to their skin, seeped into the walls, and never left the air, they didn't turn away from it. They knew this dirt. It had names. It was the soot from last week's bread fire, the oil from the axle of the cart, the soil from the grave they dug with frozen fingers. It was theirs, and so when spring finally came, when the sun warmed the roof, and a bucket of water didn't sting to the bone then, and only then, would they peel back the layers. Then they would wash. Then they would see the pink of their own skin again, like something borrowed and returned. But until then, they stayed cloaked in filth, in safety, in the strange, quiet wisdom that comes from knowing what your body needs before the world tells you otherwise. Cleanliness would come, but not before warmth, not before life. And perhaps that's the hardest part to imagine now, this idea that dirt could be tender, that the thing we're taught to fear could once have held people together, but it did not. It wrapped around them like wool. It softened the edge of every wind. And when nothing else could comfort, it did, not because it was beautiful, but because it was enough. And no one ever said it aloud, but everyone knew it. The filth wasn't shame. It was care. And that brings us to the next tale, where warmth came from steam, not soil, and where cleanliness was both a gift and a temptation, the road to cleanliness. In some places, led not to a home, but to a building that steamed like a cauldron and whispered like a church. Bathhouses hummed about in markets, judged in whispers, loved in secret for peasants near towns. They were rare escapes, places where water came warm, where walls held heat, and where, for a coin and some courage, you could forget the mud for an hour. But nothing came without weight, not even a bath. The bathhouse was both blessing and suspicion. Mothers brought sons, wives brought husbands, but always with caution, with eyes lowered, and with the knowledge that not everyone came to wash. There was the bath, yes, circular, steaming, lined with rough stone. There were wooden benches slick with sweat and walls darkened with soot. The air smelled of herbs and heat, but under the surface, always something else. Rumors, glances, a sense that this place, this moment of comfort, was too sweet to be holy. The church at times agreed that it warned that warm water stirred the flesh, that nakedness tempted sin, that too much scrubbing might lead to pride, or worse, pleasure. And yet people came, because to sit in water that didn't bite your skin, to feel the heat sink into joints that ached from frozen fields, that was something few could resist. Men bathed beside men, women beside women, sometimes in shifts, sometimes not. And while most kept to their own quiet corners, others lonely, curious, brave did not. For the lonely peasant girl, her hair let down just once a week, the bathhouse was a chance to feel beautiful, if only for a minute. To see her own face in the ripple of the water, clean and almost unrecognizable for the old farmer, hunched with decades. It was a place where the pain in his spine eased, just slightly, when he leaned back against the stones. If the soul was soot-stained, so be it. At least the body could breathe. Some bathhouses had candles tucked into wall niches, their flames dancing on steam. Others had attendants, old women who ladled water from copper basins and hummed to themselves like nuns. They knew the rhythms, who needed space, who needed silence, who needed to cry, because sometimes a bath wasn't about the dirt. It was about the weight, the kind that didn't show on the skin, but that water miraculously could lift, and, for a brief moment, that peasant, that stranger, could sit in the warmth and feel, held, but always. The bath ended, the water cooled, the whispers returned, and the walk home, wet hair freezing against the nape, reminded them that warmth was temporary, that cleanliness didn't last, that people remembered. Some saw who bathed beside whom. Some spoke of what they heard through the walls. Some came, not to wash, but to watch. And so, even as the steam softened the bones and the soap smoothed the hands, there was fear, not of illness, but of reputation, because a bath could cleanse the body, but not the judgment of others. Still, the bathhouse remained, not often, not nearby, but real, and for those who couldn't go, who lived too far, who feared too much, it became something else. A dream, a story, a temptation. There were wives who lit a pot of water and bathed their husbands in silence, imagining what it might be like to have a full tub. There were children who asked about the scent of rosemary and steam, not knowing it was real. And there were men who never went, but spoke of it with longing, like pilgrims who never reached the shrine. It was not pure, but it was needed. It was not sacred, but it was human. And that made it, in its way, holy. In the end, no one truly knew what happened behind those closed doors, but everyone imagined. And sometimes imagining was enough to warm them through another winter. So they carried the steam in their minds, the sound of dripping water, the feel of being, just for a while, clean without consequence. And the next time they scraped mud from their calves with a dull blade, or wiped their cheeks with a rough rag, they thought of that place, that room of warmth and rumor, that strange border between virtue and vice, because in a world built on silence and survival, even a bath could be dangerous. And that brings us to the next chapter, where danger didn't come from judgment or whispers, but from lice, and how hair became both a burden and a battleground. Hair, in the medieval world, was never just hair. It was a shelter for lice, a veil of modesty, a problem to be solved. In silence, for peasants, it was both too much and never enough, always tangled, always itching, always in the way. But it mattered, more than we might guess. A boy's hair was cropped short as soon as he could sit still, not for fashion, but for mercy. Lice preferred warmth, and warmth lived in hair. Short hair meant fewer bites, fewer scabs behind the ears, less scratching in the night. For girls, it was more complicated. Hair was sacred. A girl's braids were tied with string, looped tight against her scalp, hidden under linen coifs. To cut it was unthinkable unless there was plague or shame or grief. Hair was a kind of reputation. They didn't have shampoo. They didn't even have combs, most of them not the kind we think of. A few had bone combs passed down through generations, thick-toothed and worn smooth, but most used fingers, or borrowed from a neighbor when the need became too loud, because lice were loud. In their own way, they crawled. They laid eggs. They itched, not just at night, but always behind. The neck, in the soft spot under the chin, along the hairline like a border of misery. Children scratched until they bled. Adults pretended not to notice. There were cures, of course. Vinegar, when they had it. Ash, when they didn't. Sometimes garlic, crushed and rubbed in until the scalp burned. Sometimes pig lard. Nothing worked. For long, and so combing became ritual. At night, near the fire, someone would sit between someone else's knees. A mother behind her daughter, a brother behind his sister, gently pulling, dividing, searching, flicking lice into the fire when they found them. And no one spoke during this ritual. It was private, intimate, a form of love that didn't need words. Sometimes they sang, just softly, a lullaby from their own childhood, not to make the lice go, but to keep the fear away, because lice meant poverty, and poverty meant shame. But in this world, no one had the luxury of shame. Everyone had lice. Even the Lord's boy, though they never said so aloud. Hair, left unwashed, grew heavy. It soaked up smoke and oil. It clung to the scent of onions, of rain, of fear. When a woman undid her braids, the smell of her day fell to the floor with her hair, and yet she washed it sometimes. Rarely, but with care. With the same lye soap she used for her hands, knowing it would sting. She'd bend over a basin, pour cold water from a jug, and scrub until her arms ached. Then twist her hair like rope, tie it in a knot, and tuck it away again, as if to say, "This part of me is mine, not theirs. Not theirs to judge or name." And when there was no water, there was earth. They dusted their scalps with clay, rubbed in herbs, prayed to saints who never answered. Anything to keep the lice at bay. Anything to feel, for a moment, clean inside the mess. Children learned not to complain. The itch was constant. Scratching drew scolds. If you bleed, you'll get fever, their mothers warned. So they bore it. They bit their lips and learned to sit still. Some nights, you could hear it scratching in the straw beds, all around in the dark. Not angry, not frantic, just tired fingers trying to find relief. There were times it got worse after rain. During harvest, in the hot closeness of too many bodies sharing a room. Then even the smallest child could name the feeling, the crawling, the tickling, the terror, and yet no one spoke of shaving, because even lice were less shameful than a bald head. A woman without hair invited whispers. A man without it was either ill or punished. Hair was dignity. Even if it hurt, they learned to live with it, like they lived with cold, with hunger, with longing. It became part of them, and still on feast days they tried, they washed, they oiled their braids. They pulled fresh cloth over their heads and walked into town with their scalps still stinging. And if someone looked twice, they stood straighter, because they had combed, because they had tried, because the lice might live there, but they didn't own it. Hair, to the medieval peasant, was not beauty. It was a burden, a battle, but it was also a memory, a shield, a link to the way things had always been. And in the stillness of a winter evening, when a mother ran her fingers through her child's tangled locks, picking out lice one by one, there was no disgust, no pity, only love. Quiet, finger-tender love. The kind that endures, and that brings us to the next chapter, where there were no braids, no coifs, just open fields, hidden corners, and a toilet that wasn't a toilet at all. There were no hinges, no doors, no privacy, just earth open, indifferent, and endless. For the medieval peasant, a toilet wasn't a room. It wasn't even a structure. It was a place behind something, a patch of earth behind the barn, beside the wood pile, down the slope near the nettles. A quiet corner where one could crouch, hurry, and hope not to be seen. And most of the time, they weren't. But even if they were, no one said anything because everyone used the same corners. Everyone knew the smell.it started early, this understanding. Toddlers were shown where to go by being led into the trees. A mother would point to the dirt and say, "There, that was it." That was all. There were no seats, no paper, no flushing of anything. Just squatting, wiping with straw or leaves, and walking away quickly. Before the wind turned or the chickens came pecking, some families dug shallow pits and covered them with planks. A hole barely wide enough for a child's foot, where waste collected in silence. It was emptied only when the stench became unbearable, usually into fields already used for growing food. The irony was never mentioned, and no one complained. To do so would be to draw attention to a thing everyone wished to forget. So they didn't. They just accepted it. The FLIs. The smell. The way the wind carried certain truths into the kitchen if the door was left open too long. There were no euphemisms. Either. No one said, "Going to the bathroom." They said nothing. They left the room. They came back. And life continued, but for all its silence, there were rituals. Little ones. A woman might carry a rag tucked into her apron to clean herself afterward. A man might bring a stick to prod the ground, make sure nothing moved in the grass, because things did move. Frogs. Snakes. Rats. Sometimes worse. The field was never just a toilet. It was a test. Of timing. Of courage. Of balance on uneven earth when the ground was wet and your feet were bare. In winter, it was cruel. The wind bit at skin already trembling. Some waited until dawn, others didn't. The frost didn't care. A T. Night, when the air turned black and wolves howled from too close to the fence, they used buckets. Lined with hay, hidden behind curtains if curtains existed. Emptied at first light, when the world was still sleepy and forgiving, those buckets were never spoken of, even in the dirtiest homes. No one left them full. They were poured into the ditch, behind the coop, near the compost pile, then rinsed with gray water and put back beneath the bed. This was dignity. This was discipline. It didn't feel like it, but it was, because not everyone emptied their own. Children were taught early, don't step there. Don't drink from that stream. That patch near the cabbage. No, always no, and if you forgot, you learned. Quickly, they knew the risks. Worms. Fevers. Skin that burned where it shouldn't. But they had no words for infection, no potions for parasites. Just boiled herbs and whispered prayers. In towns, there were latrines, shared holes beneath wooden seats, dark and echoing. Some had boards. Some had nothing. They were communal, public, necessary, and cursed. People feared falling in. Stories were told of men who vanished, of children who misstepped, of women whose skirts dragged into deep. These stories were half true, half warning. So peasants, when they could, preferred the field. Yes, it smelled. Yes, it was exposed. But it was theirs. The sky above, the earth below. A moment of privacy in a life where privacy didn't exist, and in those moments, crouched low with skirts gathered or trousers tugged down, they were left alone. Not in comfort, not in safety, but in peace until it was over. Until they wiped, with grass or a torn piece of cloth. Until they stood again, adjusted their layers, and returned back to the fire, to the field, to the rhythm of a life so full that even the shame had worn thin. They didn't talk about it. But they knew this was part of being human, of being poor, of surviving day by dirty, necessary day And even now, centuries later, the truth still lingers in the soil. Hidden, forgotten, but there, always there, and that brings us to the next chapter, where modesty met linen, and warmth was a question of what you were beneath, or didn't underneath it all. There was often nothing, not by choice, not by rebellion, simply by necessity. Because underwear, as we think of it now, soft, stitched, expected, wasn't guaranteed in the life of a medieval peasant. In fact, it was rare. And when it did exist, it lived a hard, brief life. Most peasants didn't have a drawer of spare linens. They had one shift, one tunic, one set of clothes worn close to the skin until it wore thin enough to see through. And even then, they kept wearing it. Linen was precious. It was grown, harvested, soaked, beaten, spun, and woven by hand with time they barely had. To own undergarments made of linen was to own something quiet and sacred, to repair them with. Patches and string was an act of love, not shame, and when that linen finally failed, when the seams gave up and the cloth thinned into threads, it wasn't thrown away. It became rags, wipes, bandages, something, anything other than waste. Because waste was sin. Waste was unthinkable. So many peasants were nothing beneath their outer layers. Just skin, coarse wool, and the long, slow rub of fabric on flesh. In summer, this meant sweat. In winter, it meant cold. But always it meant exposure. Quiet, constant, unspoken. Women often wore a chemise beneath their dresses if they had one. A loose linen shift that reached the knees, yellowed with use, softened by time. It was their shield, their comfort, their only layer of modesty. When everything else came off, men might wear braize baggy, knee-length undertrousers made from the same rough linen, tied with string, gathered at the waist. They weren't flattering. They weren't fashionable. But they were a line drawn between bare and rest. And that line, fragile as it was, mattered. Children wore what they were given. A boy might wear his father's old braize rolled at the waist. A girl might have a shift sewn from the scraps of a dead aunt's clothes. There was no gender in poverty, only fabric and need. Underwear was shared, washed when it could be, hung in corners too, dry where smoke curled around it like incense. It never smelled fresh, only less sour than before. They didn't speak of it, not aloud. It was too close, too private. But everyone noticed. Who had fresh linen? Who had blood on theirs? Who had none at all, and when it rained or snow melted through the roof, the first concern was always this: did it soak through? Because wet wool was misery, but wet linen was exposure. And exposure in this world could mean death. There were moments of vulnerability too delicate to describe. A woman changing behind a sheet hung from a beam. A man stepping into frozen braize before dawn. A child crying because the fabric scratched. In places no one could reach, but there were moments of tenderness too. A mother mending her daughter's shift by candlelight, fingers trembling from the cold. A husband handing his wife the warmest piece of cloth to tuck between her thighs on a winter's night. A girl rinsing her one pair of underclothes in a river and laying them over moss to dry, praying the wind wouldn't carry them off. These were quiet acts of care, and they mattered more than we might think, because to wear clean linen just once was to feel almost royal, to feel seen even by no one, to walk through the village with something soft against your skin and nothing shameful underneath. And on rare days, when the sun came out and everything was hung to dry on lines between trees, there was beauty in it. Rags fluttering like flags, shifts glowing white for a moment before returning to beige, a kind of dignity. A kind of hope. Some found ways to cheat the cold. A folded scrap tucked inside. A second shift stolen from a better-off cousin. But most simply endured. Rubbed the rawness from their thighs. Tied their brays tighter. Prayed the wind wouldn't rise before they made it home. They didn't speak of style. They didn't chase comfort. They chased warmth. They chased modesty. They chased a moment's relief in a world where the body was always on display, even when hidden, and they carried on, because even without what we now consider basic, they had each other. A hand to help untangle knotted TIs. A laugh when something ripped in the wrong place. A shared shrug, because what else could they do? They wore what they had. And when they didn't have it, they wore their silence. And that brings us to the next chapter, where silence was broken by a baby's cry, and hygiene meant more than just cloth. It meant spit, straw, and survival. Children were not born into cleanliness. They arrived in blood, in hay, in the trembling hands of women who had seen too many winters and not enough midwives. Their first bath, if they had one, was hurried, cold, and done by lamplight. And their hygiene from that moment on was nothing. Like what we'd imagine in a world without wipes, without warm water on demand, without even a change of clothes. Keeping a child clean was an act of daily, desperate tenderness. There was no baby powder, no antiseptic, no soap that didn't sting. There was cloth if you were lucky, straw if you weren't, and there was spit warm, quick, always available. A mother's first instinct. A grandmother's unspoken cure. The youngest children went without diapers as we know them. They were wrapped in swaddling bands, tight and warm, and changed as little as possible. Because changing meant unwrapping, and unwrapping meant chill most of the time. They were left to soil the cloth. Then the cloth, stiff brown, already frayed, was scraped, rinsed in the creek, and hung to dry. The stains never left. But that wasn't the point. Clean enough was enough. Mothers kept rags tucked in their waistbands, soft from use, dotted with holes. They were used to wipe faces, hands, bottoms, anything, and then used again. Washed when they could. Burned when they couldn't. Baths came rarely, maybe once a week. More often, it was spot cleaning near the hearth, using water warmed in a pan. A corner of a tunic dipped and wrung. A small foot lifted, examined, wiped. A cheek scrubbed with a finger and spit, rubbed until the dirt came loose, the smell of. A child wasn't powdery or clean. It was sweat and wool and milk gone sour. But it was theirs. And mothers breathed it in, because love needs no perfume. Straw lined their cradles. Not soft straw. Not even clean straw. Just the driest found, bundled into corners, pressed into a low wooden box. It crackled beneath them when they turned. It itched. It stuck to skin. But it insulated. It cradled. It kept death at a small distance. Lice came early. Worms came often. And rashes. Rashes were constant. There were no creams. Only herbs. Ointments passed down by memory. Sometimes butter. Sometimes ash mixed with fat. Rubbed on the belly. Dabbed. On the inner thigh. Whispered over with a prayer no one remembered the origin of. When a baby cried, it wasn't just hunger. It was sting, dampness, chafing, and when the mother cleaned them, she did so with gentleness learned the hard way. Hands that had chopped wood, plucked feathers, hauled water, now holding a cloth like it might break. She whispered as she worked, not to soothe the child, to soothe herself, because this moment, this quiet care was hers. In a world that asked so much and gave so little, Cleaning her child was one thing she could do completely. There were no bottles, no plastic tubs, only a basin, a rag, and time she didn't really have. Father's help sometimes. Not always, but enough. They'd hold the child while the mother scraped dung from the hem of a dress. They'd rinse a cloth in cold water and drape it across a fevered brow, unsure if it helped. But trying, always trying, older children helped with the younger ones. Wiping noses, holding tiny hands while feet were dipped into cold water. Mimicking the motions they had seen and felt, not because they were told, but because it was remembered. In the body, there was pride in a clean child. Even if the clothes were torn, even if the face was red and raw, if the hands were washed, if the hair was combed, if the teeth had been scraped with a twig that morning, then the mother walked taller, but there was no shame in dirt either. Not among peasants, because dirt meant play. It meant health. It meant the child had survived another day, and that was no small thing. Sickness took many. And when it came, cleanliness became ritual. The child was wiped again and again, even as they weakened. The sweat was dabbed. The sores were covered. The body was made ready not to be healed, always but to be grieved, and when a child died, they were washed one last time, with water warmed by fire and hands warmed by sorrow. The rag used was buried with them, because no one else should wear it. No one else should carry that weight, but most lived, somehow, with straw in their beds and spit on their cheeks, with cloth that scratched and rashes that returned, with love that looked like scrubbing and lullabies hummed while cleaning, fingernails black with dirt, and that love, raw and rough as it was, stayed with them even when they grew, even when they became the ones holding the cloth, because in the end, hygiene wasn't a routine. It wasn't about health. It was about attention, about presence, about a hand that wiped you clean, even when the world had no soap left to offer. And that brings us to the next chapter, where the rain became a blessing, and bathing required no buckets, only courage, and clouds. There were days when the sky did what no peasant could afford to do. It gave water freely, not in buckets, not in basins, but in long, steady sheets that fell from clouds like mercy. And when it rained hard enough and long enough, some people washed, not bathed, in the way of warm water and quiet privacy, but washed quickly, quietly. And with gratitude. Rain was inconvenient, mostly. It turned paths to muck, soaked straw roofs, and ruined whatever scraps were hung outside to dry. But once in a while, when the wind stilled and the temperature held, a certain kind of rain would come. Soft, heavy, forgiving. That's when someone might step outside. Slowly, cautiously, first the hands, reaching past the doorframe. Then the face tilted upward. Then, if no one was watching, or if no one cared, a full step into the downpour. There was no ceremony. Just cloth being peeled back from the arms, the neck, the legs, a tunic lifted, a braid undone, and the rain. Falling, 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 like something sacred. They stood in fields where cows had trodden, beside barns where pigs dozed, in yards that smelled of smoke and wet wood. And they let the water find its way down their backs, between their shoulder blades, behind their ears, places the basin never quite reached. Children loved it. They'd run barefoot through the puddles, shrieking with glee, sliding through mud, like it was a game. Their mothers might shout, but rarely chased. There was something holy in watching them. These small bodies, brown with earth, rinsed clean by sky. Men sometimes bathed shirtless in the fields, heads bowed, arms spread, soapless, but thankful. Their backs bore scars of work, of time, of cold. But the rain softened them, made them feel almost new. For a moment, they were not farmers or fathers. Just bodies. Just flesh in the open air, and women. Women waited. Until dusk. Until the village quieted. Until no one might pass and glance and judge. Then they slipped outside. With a cloth in hand. A hope in heart. They scrubbed beneath layers. Rinsed what could not be rinsed for weeks. Pulled their hair free and shook it loose like something wild. The rain carried everything down. Sweat, soot, shame. Not completely. Not perfectly. But enough they didn't speak during these rain baths. There were no words that could hold the feeling. The strange mix of exposure and safety. Of filth and forgiveness, because the rain didn't ask for coin. It didn't care who you were. It touched the baker the same as the beggar. The woman in the clean shift and the man in rags. It was, for a moment, equal, and after, they didn't. Dry off. There were no towels. Just the wind. Just the return to shelter. Just a fire waiting, if you were lucky, or a damp blanket if you weren't. Sometimes they got sick. A cold that never left. A cough that worsened. And still they bathed. Again, the next time the sky offered it. Because risk was constant. But so was need. And it wasn't just about cleanliness. It was about feeling different. About feeling the sky touch your skin instead of the soil. About being more than a body bent over a field, or a pot, or a child. About stepping into something vast and not being punished for it. Sometimes they looked up, let the rain fall into their eyes, closed them, stood still, and breathed. They didn't call it a ritual. But it was one, a peasant's baptism. An invisible luxury, a stolen moment of peace. And when the rain stopped, because it always did, they went back inside. They rubbed their arms, wrung out their sleeves, pulled straw from their feet, and they sat down, feeling no cleaner to the eye, but somehow lighter. It didn't change their lives, but it softened them in places nothing else could reach. And the next morning, someone might look at them and say, "You look different," and they would smile and not explain, because the sky had come. For them, because for one rare, silent night, the world had washed them clean. And that brings us to the next chapter, where filth returned, as it always did, but not to the body, to the village itself, to the air, to the scent that told you exactly where you were. Even with your eyes closed, every village had a smell. Not a metaphor, not a memory, a real, thick, living scent that greeted you before you saw the rooftops, that clung to the hem of your clothes, followed you into dreams, and never quite left your skin. You didn't notice it if you lived there. But strangers did. It wasn't just manure, though there was plenty of that. Horse, pig, cow, even human. It was smoke from peat fires, sour milk spilled on dirt floors, wet wool steaming beside the hearth, and meat hung a day too long. It was old water in old buckets, cabbage left too near the stove, ash stirred from yesterday's coals. It was sweat, always sweat, not sharp, like fear, but deep, baked into seams, lurking in collars, shared by every body that passed through the narrow paths between homes with no windows that opened, and no one minded. Because when everyone smelled, no one did, the village itself breathed at this mixture of effort, rot, warmth, and time. It soaked into the thatch, into the beams, into the earth pressed hard beneath calloused feet. There were attempts sometimes to cover it. A handful of herbs hung above the door. A sprig of rosemary tied to a child's neck when sickness swept through. A clay bowl of vinegar left near the bed of someone already too pale, but the scent always came back. Visitors might wrinkle their noses. They might walk a little faster, but villagers didn't flinch. To them, the smell was the smell of life. Not good, not bad, just there, and if you left, you missed it. Strange but true. A woman who married into another village would sometimes wake up and feel something was wrong, not because of what she smelled, but because of what she didn't. There were worse smells too. The butcher's pit after a storm. A birth gone wrong. A well gone sour. Those were different. Those carried fear. Those weren't ignored, but the everyday smell, the bass note of the village, it was background music. A hum that softened you to the truth. This was a place where people worked, bled, birthed, burned, and buried. It wasn't clean. It wasn't supposed to be. Children learned it early. Babies cried less in houses that stank like smoke and sheep than in houses freshly scrubbed, because comfort for them wasn't lavender. It was warmth, familiarity, a father's shirt, a mother's braid, a dog's belly after lying in compost, and so the smell wrapped around them like a second skin. Not fragrant, but honest. Some tried harder than others. A woman might sweep her floor daily, chase out the hens, shake her rugs. A man might haul fresh straw more often, rinse his boots in the creek. But they never won. Not really, because a village is a living thing. And living things smell. There was dignity in that. Strange as it sounds, in knowing your place had a scent. In knowing it would be remembered not by statues or songs, but by the way it filled someone's nose the first time they arrived, and the last time they left. Sometimes when a person died, someone would pause in their home afterward. Breathe in. Say softly, "It still smells like her," and no one needed to ask what that meant. The scent was part of mourning and part of joy. A baby newly born was sniffed like bread just out of the oven. A new bride's shift washed in. River water and dried in the sun was pressed to the face and smiled at. It never lasted. But that didn't matter. The village would reclaim it. Add it to the mix. One day, someone would invent soap that smelled like flowers. Another would bottle perfume in glass. But these people knew something we often forget: that scent isn't always about sweetness. Sometimes it's about truth, and the truth of a medieval village lived in its air. In the breath of the barn, in the steam rising from a pot left to boil too long, in the stillness after rain, in the thick dark of a room lit by tallow, and hope. No one loved the smell, but they loved what it meant. It meant life continued. Meals were cooked. Fires were lit. Children ran and grew and didn't die, and in that there was something beautiful, something you couldn't bottle. Only breathe. And that brings us to the next chapter, where water wasn't used every day, but only on the days that mattered: feast days, wedding days, holy days when the act of washing became a kind of prayer. Not every day deserved soap. Not every day earned water. But some days were special. Feast days, wedding days, holy days. Days when the bells rang out louder, and the bread was baked longer, and the air felt almost kind. Those were the days you washed, not because it was comfortable. It rarely was. But because it meant something. There was reverence in the ritual. A kind of hush that fell across the village as the water was drawn. From wells, from streams, from barrels catching rain. Wherever it came from, it was carried with care, and once it was inside into kitchens dark with soot and warmth, it was set to warm over the fire. Slowly, patiently, because hot water was luxury. And these were days for luxuries. Clothes were pulled off layer by layer, folded neatly or tossed aside depending on the mood. Shifts were checked for holes. Brays were turned inside out, rubbed between fingers, inspected as if they might embarrass their owners in church, and then, when everything was ready, the washing began, not with grandeur, but with small, intimate movements, a cloth dipped and wrung, a hand pressed to a shoulder, a cheek, a knee, water poured over feet gone gray with dust, hair unbraided and scrubbed with fingers that knew every knot. They didn't speak much during this kind of washing. The silence wasn't awkward. It was sacred. As if talking too loudly might chase the warmth away, children were washed first. They squirmed and squealed, laughing when the water splashed, crying when the cloth was too rough. Mothers wiped behind their ears, under their arms, down between their toes. And when they were clean enough, they were wrapped in linen and set. Near the fire, cheeks glowing like coals, then came the elders. Bent backs, wrinkled skin, eyes closed as the water touched them, remembering things their mouths had long forgotten, and last the workers, the ones who carried the buckets, the ones who lit the fires, the ones who scrubbed everyone else. They washed quickly, quietly, never asking for help, but even they, for just one moment, stood in the steam and let it soften them. It wasn't just the body being cleaned. It was the memory, the week that came before, the aches, the arguments, the failures, all of it rinsed, if not gone, then dulled. Some added herbs to the water, if they had any. A few dried sprigs of lavender, a little sage, maybe thyme. Not for scent, for symbolism. Clean skin and clean soul together, they used their best rags, their only rags, the ones they saved in a basket tucked behind the hearth, the ones too precious for daily grime. Feast day washing wasn't about comfort. It was about dignity. To walk into church with a clean neck, to greet your neighbor without crusted fingers, to sit at the feast table without flinching from your own smell. These were victories, and when it came to weddings, the bride was scrubbed. With care so tender, it nearly hurt. Her sisters washed her back. Her mother combed her hair. The village girls whispered as they worked of love, of fear, of the way the groom would lift her veil, and the groom. He bathed in silence, alone or with a brother, rubbing ash into his skin like penance, wiping his mouth, his eyes, his hands over, and over until they looked new, because marriage demanded more than love. It demanded presentation, and feast days, those holy interruptions in a life of repetition, demanded the same. They didn't have mirrors, not really. Just water, still enough to reflect. And so they bent over it, seeing themselves as if for the first time. And sometimes they smiled. The children noticed. Ma looks like a lady today, and Ma would hush them, but her eyes would soften. Because, for one day, maybe she did, after the washing came the dressing. The best tunic, the cleanest shift, the apron with the least mending, and then the scent of bread in the air, bells ringing, the scrape of chairs across floors, the sound of feet on packed earth, moving toward something sacred they gathered. Clean, if only slightly. Different, if only briefly, and even if no one else noticed, if the priest didn't comment, if the neighbor still scowled, they knew they had washed. They had tried. They had lifted themselves out of the week's weight and stood taller, if only until the sun went down and after the feast, when the fires dimmed and the smells of the meal gave way to smoke and sweat again, they went to bed, knowing something important, that even if they were poor, even if they were tired, even if the world didn't see them, they had washed, they had made themselves ready, not for judgment, not for reward, but because they could, because sometimes, even in a world of filth and hardship, you get to choose to be clean, and that brings us to the next chapter, where cleanliness was shared, not singular, where one towel touched many hands and where hygiene became something communal and quietly complicated. There was usually just one towel, not one per person, one per family, sometimes one for a whole household of 10. A rectangle of linen, worn thin and patched in the corners, hung on a nail near the hearth or draped over the edge of a wooden chest. It didn't feel soft. It wasn't white. It rarely smelled fresh, but it was there. And that meant something. You didn't grab it without asking. You didn't wipe your boots on it. You didn't let it drop to the ground. That towel was trusted with too much to be treated carelessly. It dried hands scrubbed raw from the garden. It patted clean faces before feast days. It wrapped around the shoulders of a child too cold to speak. It knew the shapes of the people it served. It remembered their lives after someone washed weather. From a bowl, a bucket, or the sky itself, they reached for the towel. Sometimes it was damp already, sometimes still warm from the last set of hands. And yet, it was used again, because what else was there? Each morning, a mother might hang it near the fire. Let the smoke dry it out. Let the heat kill whatever clung to it, if it could. And then it was folded and replaced, ready for the next hand, the next wound, the next moment of care. If the towel was too wet, it was wrung out. If it was too stiff, it was beaten gently against the side of the house until it bent again. There were no washing machines, no backup supply. Some families had two. That was luxury. One for washing, one for birth or death, hidden in a chest and only brought out when the ordinary wasn't enough. Children knew not to play with it, not to tie it into capes or twist it into ropes. They were scolded if they did, not out of cruelty but out of necessity. That towel was their only line between clean and dirty, between cared for and not. And yes, it spread germs, not because they didn't care, but because they didn't know, or maybe they did. In a quiet way, they noticed when the cough spread through the house, when one child grew pale and then another. They noticed when someone wiped their nose and then passed the towel along. But what were they to do? Not dry their hands, let their hair drip down their backs until it froze in the air? They chose comfort over caution, because the danger was distant. The damp was immediate, and in a way, the towel wasn't just cloth. It was connection. It dried tears. It wiped flour from foreheads. It cleaned scraped knees, mopped up spills, pressed into armpits after a long walk from the field. It was there when no one else was. It listened in its own way, held secrets in its fibers. Sometimes after illness, it was boiled, dropped into a pot and stirred with a stick, steam rising like prayer. Not often, but sometimes, and then laid out to dry on a branch or a fence post. It flapped like a flag of surrender. I did my best, it seemed to say. Use me again, and they did. In households with many people, it became a silent rhythm, a rotation. The towel traveled room to room, always needed, never idle. On Sundays, when everything was a little slower, someone might take it to the stream, beat it against the rocks, watch the water turn brown with a week's worth of living, then carry it back. Damp, but proud. A good towel lasted years. A great one, decades. Mended and re-mended, turned at the edges, eventually cut into smaller cloths for babies, or for binding wounds, or for washing the dead. When it finally gave out, it wasn't thrown away. It was buried, or burned, or kept in a drawer, because some things hold more memory than fabric. And when a house caught fire, people tried to save the towel. That should tell you everything, because hygiene wasn't personal in that world. It was shared, passed from hand to hand like bread, like grief, like warmth, and maybe that's why they didn't flinch when it touched their skin, even damp, even stained, even with the faint scent of someone else's life still clinging to it, because to them, that was what love smelled like. Not roses, not soap, but smoke and skin, and the shared courage to keep trying. And that brings us to the next chapter, where smell itself became a kind of diagnosis, where sickness announced itself not with sound, but with a scent too sweet to be trusted. It didn't begin with a cough. Not always. Sometimes it began with a smell. Not the usual smells, the smoke, the sweat, the sour breath of too many mouths sharing the same air. No, this was something else. Something sweet. Sickness in the medieval world had a scent. And people knew it. They might not have had names for germs or fevers, but they knew when something was wrong. When the body turned inward, when the heat rose behind the eyes and the limbs felt like water, when the breath thickened, and most of all when the smell changed, a sweetness that wasn't right. Not like honey, not like fruit, but like rot pretending to be sugar. You'd walk into a room and pause. The fire was burning. The stew was still simmering. But something in the air made you squint, made your stomach curl. That was how it began. Mothers would sniff their babies in the night. Not out of habit, but instinct. They knew what health smelled like. Wool, milk, mud. When that scent changed, when it became too clean, too still, they knew. Before the fever came, before the crying started. It wasn't always fatal, but it was always frightening. A child smelling too sweet might survive, or not. A man who began to reek of ripe apples might walk to work in the morning and collapse by sundown. A woman whose skin turned fragrant unnaturally so was whispered over, watched closely, wiped down with vinegar and worry. They tried things, bundles of herbs, hung from doorways. Lavender, if it was growing. Sage, if they could find it. They believed certain scents drove sickness away, like smoke chases bees. Others burned rosemary or set bowls of onion in the corners of the room. The smell of strength, they called it. The smell of protection, but the sick still smelled sweet. And the sweetness deepened. It was worse just before death. When the breath shortened, when the body stilled. That's when the scent filled the room like spilled wine. Too rich, too round, almost floral. The living knew to hold their breath then, to step back, to wrap their faces in cloth, not because they understood transmission, but because the air itself felt dangerous. Midwives whispered of the fever smell. Gravidigers called it the sugar of death. Some said it was the soul boiling out. Others said it was the devil's cologne, but no one denied it. Everyone had smelled it. There were kinds of death you could hear violent, loud, gasping. And there were kinds she smelled too sweet to die. But mostly, the scent told the truth. Washing didn't help. It clung to skin, to breath, to cloth. Even after the person was gone, the room would need days of open air. Windows, if they existed, propped with sticks. Rags burned. Straw changed. Even then, the sweetness lingered. Not beautiful. Never beautiful. Just wrong. And if you smelled it again on someone new, in another room, you wouldn't say anything. You'd just press your lips together, fetch a bowl of water, and sit beside them, because the only kindness left was presence. When darkness came, and the world shrank to the space between the mattress and the rafters, the skin remembered. It began slowly. A twitch of the calf, a prickling on the scalp. Then the scratch casual at first, then deeper, then desperate. And once you scratched one spot, the others woke up too. Neck, waist, ankles, back. Places you couldn't reach no matter how you twisted. Children whimpered. Adults sighed. But no one complained aloud. Because what was there to say? Everyone itched. It was the song of the straw bed. The bedding never helped. Mattresses were sacks of hay. Old hay. The kind that crumbled into dust and held on to heat. Moisture and insects like a second skin. Sometimes mixed with dried leaves. Sometimes with rags. Always reused. Always shared. In the folds of that bedding lived more than sleep. Fleas jumped from fold to fold. Lice crawled along seams. Mites. Nestled into stitching so tight they were part of the fabric. They didn't mean harm. They were just hungry. But their hunger made the nights long. A mother might sleep beside her child, and, even in dreams, reach to scratch a spot on their back. A father might wake to the sound of rubbing his wife's heel, dragging against the straw again and again. Like a rhythm that couldn't stop. Some tried tricks. Dried herbs tucked into the mattress. Tansy, wormwood, mint. Ash rubbed into sheets. Clothes boiled once a season if water and time allowed. But nothing lasted, and so they adapted. They scratched until the skin broke. They bled in small places. They woke with welts, and they accepted it. Some nights they slept through it. Exhaustion has a way of getting. But the truth was simpler. The fleas were always there. And no one remembered a time without them. They came with the straw, with the dog, with the neighbor's borrowed shift, with life, and still they slept, because the body can rest, even in discomfort. Because love still breathed, even in the itchy dark. A couple might lie tangled together, scratching each other's backs in the dark. Not out of romance, out of ritual, out of care. One would whisper, lower, the other would scratch. A pause, a sigh, sleep. And in that moment, the itch became something else, a thread between them, a reminder that they were alive, that they were together. And when dawn came, when boots met cold floorboards and smoke was coaxed from damp logs, they rose with scratch. Marks still fresh, and minds already forgetting the worst of it, because the day held other discomforts. And the night's itches, somehow, always faded in the light, and that brings us to the next chapter, where the dirt under their nails wasn't shameful, it was medicine. Because healing didn't always come from clean hands sometimes. It came from mud. They didn't have ointments. They didn't have bandages sealed in wax paper, or antiseptic bombs, or little bottles marked for wounds. They had earth, and belief, and hands that knew how to hold hurt without trembling. In the medieval village, healing came not from clean white linens or glass vials. It came from what was beneath their feet. Mud, clay, ash, leaves. Smoke.it sounds wrong now, but to them, it was the most natural thing in the world. A child falls in the field, blood running from a knee gashed on a stone. The mother kneels, scoops a clump of wet earth cool, dark, soft, and presses it to the wound. No flinching, no pause. Because mud draws out the bad, she says. The heat, the poison, the hurt, and maybe it does. Maybe it doesn't. But it comforts. And that matters more. Mud was more than mess. It was balm. A paste of instinct and desperation. They mixed it with herbs when they had them. Yarrow for bleeding. Plantain for stings. Comfrey called knitbone, crushed with the heel of a wooden spoon and stirred into the soil. They wrapped the mix in rags, tied it to arms, legs, foreheads. It wasn't clean, but it was care, a burn from the hearth. Dab it with cooled ash and honey. A swelling on the foot? Soak it in a basin of muddy water and say nothing until the ache fades. A rash that won't leave? Coat it in clay, let the skin crack, then peel it away like something forgiven. They understood textures. Cool soot-soothed heat. Sticky resin-sealed wounds. Rough bark scratched out infection. These were lessons not written down, but passed between. Hands and held in memory, the healer, if the village had one, wasn't a doctor. She was someone who knew how to listen. Not just to people, but to the ground. She'd walk into the woods with a basket and come back with hope, and if the healer wasn't there, then the mother became one. Or the daughter, or the old man who had once been cut and lived to tell about it. They used what was near. A potato, sliced thin and tied to a fevered chest. A cobweb rolled and tucked into a gash to stop the bleeding. Boiled moss, if nothing else. People healed slowly, imperfectly. Scars were everywhere, shoulders, knees, necks, and each one held a story, not of pain, but of survival. Here, they'd say, pulling back a sleeve. That's where I fell during the flood. Or, that one, from the cow, years ago. No shame. Just proof even the animals were treated with mud. A horse's infected hoof. A goat's bleeding ear. Packed with clay. Tied with rags. Trusted to the elements and the passing time. The mud came from trusted places, stream banks, deep under fields. Shaded ditches where frogs sang. Not all mud was healing. Some was just dirt. But they knew the difference. Felt it in their fingers. It wasn't sterile. It wasn't safe by modern measures. But it was something. And in a world with no hospitals, no pills, no promises, something was precious. And there was comfort in the ritual. In the way mud felt against the skin, cold, grounding. In the way steam rose from a heated poultice in winter, carrying with it the faint scent of pine or mint. In the way hands moved slowly when they were helping. Gentle, steady, full of memory. A boy who limped to the hearth was soothed not just by the treatment, but by the attention. He was seen. He was touched. He was made whole, even if the wound still throbbed. There were prayers sometimes whispered as the poultice was laid. Draw the sickness out, they'd say. Let the earth take what it can, and if the wound festered, if the fever rose, if death came anyway, they did not blame the mud. They thanked it for trying, because healing in that world wasn't a guarantee. It was an effort, a gesture, a sign of love. And so they kept trying, even when the herbs ran out, even when the cuts kept opening, even when hope was thin as linen. Worn through, they scooped the earth. They believed in it. They spread it like a promise, because even if it didn't cure, it cared. And that was enough. And that brings us to the next chapter, where scent once again spoke louder than words, not the scent of earth, but of judgment. Where the way you smelled decided the way you were treated. They didn't need to see you to know who you were. They could smell you first, not in malice. In recognition. In judgment, the medieval world was built on scent. On who stank the least, not who smelled good. And for peasants, the nose often spoke before the mouth. There were no perfumes in the cottages. No scented soaps. No lavender sachets slipped between folded tunics. Smell clung to people like names did assign, inescapable and full of meaning. You smelled of your labor. If you were a tanner, it was piss and hide. If you were a shepherd, it was lanolin and sheep breath. If you were a cook, it was onions, smoke, and meat turned just slightly too late. And if you were a peasant woman with children, it was milk, cabbage, soot, and sleep lost in the folds of your sleeves. And yet, among all the smells, Some were seen as worse. Not because they were stronger, but because they betrayed you. A person who reeked of stagnant water was ignored. A person who carried the sharp scent of unwashed linen was avoided. And a person who mixed too many smells at once: dirt, sweat, rot was whispered about because that meant neglect. That meant failure, not just of the body, but of the soul. Even among those who were poor, there was a hierarchy. And the scent you or told others exactly where you belonged. It wasn't wealth. That defined you. It was effort. A woman who bathed once a week was praised even if her shoes were patched, even if her home was cold, because she tried. A man who scraped his hands clean after digging graves might be respected because he knew what dirt was and when to leave it outside. But the ones who let the stink build, the ones whose hair turned greasy, whose breath soured, whose shirts stiffened with days of sweat, they became something else. Not just poor. Low people didn't always speak the insult aloud, but they stepped back in a room. They turned there, faces in the square. They passed the bowl down the line, skipping a hand they feared might sour the broth. Shame lived in those gestures. And the shamed knew there were days when a mother held her child close, not for comfort, but to mask her. Scent. Nights when a father sat alone outside the house, knowing his work had marked him too deeply for closeness, and there were the young ones. Boys and girls reaching toward adolescence, suddenly aware of what their bodies were becoming. They sniffed at their sleeves, scrubbed at their armpits with cold cloth, tried to hide the greasy hair under wool caps, because they knew, even before anyone told them, smell wasn't private. It followed you, named you, condemned you, and yet there was also rebellion. Some leaned into it. Let the smoke become armor. Let the animal scent of the barn become a badge. Let their hands stain and their breath go unguarded, because if the world was going to judge them. Anyway, why not lean in? Others fought it, inch by inch, boiling water over tiny fires, washing their shifts with sand, hanging tunics on hedges in the wind and hoping it would carry the scent away. They used rosemary if they had it, sage if they could trade for it, chewed parsley to freshen the mouth, rubbed thyme into their palms, not because it worked, but because it made them feel like they had tried. And in the rare moments when someone said, "You smell clean," there was pride. Sharp and quiet, the kind that held back tears, because being clean wasn't just about water. It was about worth, and being told you smelled good even once meant someone had seen you, not just the labor, not just the dirt, but you. And so they tried, day after day, even when the water was cold, even when the cloth was rough, even when the smell always came back. They tried, because smell could shame you, but it could also lift you, make someone lean in instead of step away, and that was worth everything. And that brings us to the next chapter, where a rare, sacred moment of washing didn't come from habit or hygiene, but from transformation, where a bride or groom stepped into water, not just to be clean, but to become someone new. They were never cleaner than on the day they married, not because they lived in luxury, far from it, but because marriage, even in a life built from mud and fire and fatigue, demanded something close to reverence, something close to rebirth. And so, the day before a wedding, sometimes the morning of, there was a wash. Not the everyday wiping of hands, not the hurried rinse after chores, but a true, deliberate cleansing. The bride was tended first. By her mother, her sisters, her closest friend, in a room that might have been cold, or crowded, or smoky with the scent of meat and bread. But for those few hours, it was made sacred. They began with her hair, unbraided slowly, gently, combed through with fingers and, if lucky, a wooden comb softened by years of use. The tangles weren't cursed, they were remembered. This one from when she fell into the stream. This one from the time she hid in the barley. Then they brought the water. Sometimes warm, often not. Carried in buckets. Heated over coals. Poured into a basin too small for comfort, but wide enough to hold hope. She stood in it, barefoot and silent. Her arms were lifted, her back turned. Her body touched not with passion, but with intention. They scrubbed with linen, with straw, with ash. They sang sometimes, low, wordless hums that wrapped around her like another layer of cloth. She was not a bride yet. She was a girl being softened into someone new. Each part of her washed was not just cleaned, but released. The knees that once bent in games, the hands that had held bread and branches, the neck that had turned quickly when her name was called. In play, all now made ready, and when she stepped from the basin, dripping and flushed, they wrapped her in the cleanest cloth they had. Not white, not silk, but pressed. A little sweet smelling, perhaps, from herbs dried on a shelf through winter. And she sat by the fire, hair drying, eyes wide, a little afraid, a little proud. The groom, meanwhile, bathed alone, or with a brother, or with the man who'd taught him how to sharpen a scythe. He didn't speak. Men didn't, but they understood the ritual, the importance of walking into marriage without the stink of pigs or the stain of mud behind the knees. He shaved, if he could, trimmed his nails, scrubbed the skin until it reddened, because pain was better than ridicule. And when it was done, he stood still, let the steam rise from his chest, felt the newness. No one told him what to feel, but he felt it anyway. Both would be dressed in their finest, not new clothes, but borrowed. A cousin's clean tunic, a neighbor's linen veil, a belt with no stains, if one could be found. And as they approached the chapel, or the field, or the stone where the priest waited, the crowd would nod, not because the couple was beautiful, but because they were clean. And in that moment, that meant everything. Children watched in awe. Look how shiny her hair is. His hands don't even have dirt. They didn't know the hours it took. The cold water, the blistered fingers, the whispered arguments about who would fetch more water when the pot boiled down too soon. They only saw the glow. And maybe that was enough. After the ceremony, the smell returned. Slowly, quietly. By nightfall, they were themselves again. The straw in the bedding would itch. The shift would cling. The scent of onions and sweat would rise between them like a blanket, but they would remember that once they were clean together, touched with care, looked at with reverence, and that memory would linger even longer than the warmth, because cleanliness wasn't just about water. It was about transition, the moment before everything changed. And that brings us to the next chapter, where water wasn't shared in ritual or celebration, but in routine. Where bath day wasn't about joy, it was about effort and exhaustion and the weight of trying to be human once again. It didn't come often, bath day. The phrase alone sounded like luxury until you lived it, because for a medieval peasant, bathing wasn't a relaxing soak or a candlelit ritual. It was labor, a day carved out from survival. A small war fought with cold water, stiff cloth, and the heavy burden of self-restoration. A tea began with decision. Not everyone bathed at the same time. You had to choose when the chores could wait, when no guests were expected, when the sky looked kind enough not to freeze the steam before it rose, and then the preparations, water. So much water. It had to be hauled, bucket by bucket, from the well or stream. Heavy, sloshing loads carried by hand and back and hip, spilled across feet, poured into the basin or wooden tub, if the family even had one, then the fire. Built strong, tended carefully. A pot of water warmed, another kept on standby. A slow layering of heat and patience, and when the temperature felt right, not hot, never hot, but warm enough not to bite it, began, clothes peeled away like bark, stuck to skin, pulled from arms sore with work. A quick prayer, maybe. A small moment of silence. And then the plunge. It wasn't graceful. They squatted, crouched, bent knees that never stopped aching, washed with cloth or hand or whatever was nearest. The soap, if there was any, was lye-based. Sharp. It burned small cuts, stung open skin. But they used it anyway, because not using it meant the wash would never feel done. Hair was the hardest. It took time to wet, time to scrub, time to rinse. The water darkened quickly, and still they poured more. Over the back, over the shoulders, down legs that had walked too far. Too many days in a row, the water turned gray, then brown. A basin of proof. Proof of the week or the month just lived. They didn't speak during the bath. Not out of modesty, but because the effort left. No room for words. Sometimes they wept. Not loudly, just a tear or two, mixed in with the water and the steam. Not from sorrow. From release, because there was a strange intimacy in facing yourself without mud, without smoke, seeing your hands as they were, your chest, your feet, remembering what your skin looked like before the world clung to it. Some bathed in corners of kitchens, others in the yard, if no one was watching. Some crouched behind barns, letting water drip onto earth already soaked in other kinds of labor. A towel, if there was one, was used carefully, dabbed, pressed, not rubbed. Rubbing wasted the fabric. Sometimes they used old cloths, then laid them out to dry on hedges like humble flags of dignity, and when it was done, there was no applause, no compliments, just clothes, reworn, pulled on over clean skin. Sometimes those clothes weren't clean themselves. That was fine. That was expected, because in that moment, the body was the achievement. The body was fresh. The body was, for now, untouched by dust. Afterward, they sat by the hearth, on the threshold, under a patch of sky, letting themselves be still, letting the fire dry their hair, letting the warmth settle into their bones like a blessing. They didn't feel beautiful, but they felt, returned to themselves until the next day came, and the smoke, and the sweat, and the work that didn't stop just because you had taken a moment to remember you were more than a tool. Some didn't bathe again for weeks, some for months, but they held the memory of it, the weight of water on their shoulders, the sting of soap across the knuckles, the brief perfect silence when the body didn't itch or ache or carry the weight of the field on its skin. And so bath day became something more than hygiene. It became hope, proof that beneath the labor, the dirt, the fear, there was still a person worth the effort. And that brings us to the next chapter, where mouths opened not for prayer, but for brushing, and hygiene became not about the skin, but about the strange, bitter ritual of cleaning the teeth. It was never minty. It was never fresh. And no one called it brushing, but peasants cleaned their teeth quietly, crudely, stubbornly, because even in a world of rot and rough bread, the mouth mattered. There was no toothpaste, no bristles, no plastic handles, just twigs, ash, cloth, fingernails. If it came to that, they didn't clean their teeth to whiten them. They didn't do it for vanity. They did it for survival, because when your food is hard, your tools are scarce, and your doctor is a whisper. And a prayer you keep with teeth you have, mornings began with a mouthful of cold water. Swished. Spat. Not for taste, but to rinse away the soreness of sleep. Sometimes salt was added, if it was available. Sometimes vinegar, though that burned. Twigs were chewed until frayed fibers softened into a kind of bristle. Hazel was best, if you could find it. Birch, too. They called them toothsticks. They kept one in their pocket, tucked in their apron, or left near the hearth beside the comb and the cloth for wiping noses. Some rubbed ash into their gums. Wood. Ash, fine and soft. It scraped away bits of food, scratched at the film left by stew, by bread, by fear. It didn't taste good, but it worked. Others used cloth. A piece of linen wrapped around the finger, dipped in salt or vinegar or nothing at all, and rubbed along the teeth until the gums ached. There was no guarantee it helped, but it felt like trying. And trying counted for something. They didn't floss, but they picked constantly. With thorns, with straw, with sharpened bits of wood. They worked food out of their teeth not for cleanliness, but for comfort. Because stuck bread meant pain. And pain, left long enough, became rot. Rot was feared. Not the way we fear it now, not with dental plans and antiseptic rinses, but deeply, silently. A blackened tooth meant infection. Infection meant swelling. Swelling meant fever. Fever meant maybe never waking again. So they guarded their mouths. In small, stubborn ways, some rinsed with wine when wine was cheap, or beer when beer was safer than the water. It wasn't about flavor. It was about wiping away yesterday. They avoided sugar, not by choice, but by circumstance. It was rare. When it came dried fruit, a precious honey cake at a wedding, it was consumed slowly, reverently, and then followed by guilt, and sometimes pain. Because sugar even then meant danger, they didn't smile with teeth. Not because they were ashamed, but because they didn't need to. Smiles were in the eyes, in the tilt of the head, in the warmth of a hand reaching for yours across the table. Still, when they laughed, and they did laugh, often you saw their teeth, worn, crooked, stained by ash and time, but present, still theirs, and if one fell out, it was saved, shown to a child, buried with a quiet word, because a lost tooth was a loss of power, a sign that the body was aging, that softness was creeping in where strength had lived. Toothaches were suffered through. A clove might be bitten down on hard, sharp, numbing. A heated stone held to the cheek. A prayer whispered into the fire. And the pain endured until it passed or didn't. There were no dentists. There were blacksmiths. If things grew dire. A tooth pulled with tongs. The root snapped like a stick. Blood wiped on a sleeve. No one wanted it to come to that. So they cleaned. With twigs. With ash. With cloth. With persistence. Because cleanliness, even in the mouth, was a kind of resistance. A way of saying, I may be poor. I may be hungry. I may sleep in a house that leaks. But I will not rot, and that mattered. It mattered to the mother who taught her child to chew the stick every morning. To the husband who brought a twig home for his wife, broken fresh from the hazel tree. To the girl who bit into bread and felt. No pain, not yet, not today, and in the quiet of evening, when the fire dimmed and the village curled into itself, someone might sit with a toothstick in their mouth, chewing slowly, thoughtfully, as the embers glowed, not for beauty, not for praise, but because it was one of the few things they could control. And that brings us to the next chapter, where someone stood apart, the cleanest peasant in the village. Not richer, not luckier, just different. The one who scrubbed harder, washed longer, and refused quietly to surrender to the grime every village had one. Not a lord, not a priest, but someone strange in a quiet, unspoken way. The clean one, not clean like noblemen, not perfumed, powdered, or pressed, but cleaner than the rest. Suspiciously so, a woman who washed her linens more often than needed. A man who scraped mud from his boots before entering the tavern every time. A boy who combed his hair even when no one was watching. A girl who smelled faintly of mint, even. In winter, people noticed. People always noticed. In a world where hygiene was seasonal and effort was currency, someone who tried too hard stood out. And standing out was dangerous. They weren't always liked. The cleanest peasant was often called proud. Too neat for her own good. Too careful. Too soft. Who's she trying to impress? They'd mutter. Doesn't work hard enough to sweat, or worse, thinks she's better than us. But that wasn't it. Not really. The cleanest peasant wasn't proud. She was afraid. Afraid of being swallowed by the dirt. Of disappearing into the smell of cabbage and sweat. Of losing herself under the weight of dust and work and noise. So she fought it. Quietly. Daily, she boiled her water longer. She added rosemary to her washcloth. She wiped down the table even when no guests were coming. She folded the same shift twice before wearing it. She knew it would all return: the grime, the grease, the endless dark under her nails. But for a few moments each day, she held it off. Sometimes she was a widow. Sometimes a girl with no dowry. Sometimes just someone with silence in her past and too much time in her hands. And she wasn't always a she. Sometimes it was the boy who fetched water early, who lined his boots in hay so they wouldn't stink, who hung his one shirt to dry in the sun before others woke. He too was called strange, won't last in the fields, they said. Washes like a priest, but he didn't do it for praise. He did it because it made the day bearable, because waking up to a clean face in a cracked mirror meant something. Because putting on a shirt that didn't smell like 3 nights of sweat gave him strength. Cleanliness, for them, was not vanity. It was rebellion. A gentle defiance against the rot of the world, and it cost them. They were left out of gossip. Watched in church. Teased in the fields, children mimicked their mannerisms, pretended to wipe their faces with exaggerated daintiness. Adults rolled their eyes, but they were also envied because when sickness came, the cleanest peasant survived longer. When guests arrived unexpectedly, theirs was the home that didn't smell of smoke. When sorrow visited, they had a place to sit that wasn't covered in dust, and sometimes, just sometimes, someone else would knock on their door. Ask to borrow soap. Ask to sit near their fire. Ask to learn how to make the linen dry that fast, and the clean one would smile, not smugly, not triumphantly, but kindly, because they hadn't chosen to be clean. They had chosen not to be lost. It was hard. Every day it was hard. The water was heavy. The cloths were coarse. The fire took time. The neighbors whispered, but still they scrubbed, not to impress, not to escape, but to remember who they were. They kept their corners swept, their hair combed, their hands rinsed when no one was watching, and in the quiet moments after the field work was done, after the sky turned to soot and the fire sank low, they sat in their little corner of the world, clean, tired and alone, but not ashamed because their skin itched less. Their pillows smelled faintly of lavender. Their hands, though rough, felt like their own, and that was enough. And that brings us to the next chapter, where cleanliness no longer mattered, because death had come, and in those final moments, even the poorest were washed with care. Before returning to the same dirt, they spent their lives trying to rise above. They weren't always clean in life. But in death, they were made so, because no matter how thick the dirt, how worn the hands, how many days passed without soap or water, the dead were always washed. It wasn't a luxury. It was a promise. One final kindness from the living too. The leaving, when a peasant died, the world didn't stop. The pigs still needed feeding. The bread still needed rising. But inside the home, time softened, a basin was filled. Not quickly, not with boiling water or perfumes. Just enough warmth to keep the chill from biting too deep. A cloth was chosen, the softest one they had, often an old shirt, folded and stored for this very day. The hands who did the washing were quiet. A sister, a son, a neighbor who had done. This more than once. They didn't speak, not much. Sometimes a prayer. Sometimes a murmur of the dead one's name. Sometimes just silence and the sound of cloth against skin. The body was cleaned slowly. Not out of fear, but out of care. They began with the face, wiping away the salt of sweat, the traces of effort, the fear that may have lingered in the final breath. Then the hands, those tired hands that had carried so much, mended so many seams, scraped so many stones. The hands were held, fingers smoothed, nails cleaned with a twig, then the feet calloused, cracked, often cold. The feet that had walked through fields, through snow, through mud. The feet were rinsed, dried, and wrapped. It wasn't about making them presentable. It was about making them light, stripped of labor, freed of the weight of the world. The hair was combed, or braided, or tucked behind the ears like it had been when they were young. If there were sores, they were covered. If there were wounds, they were gently cleaned. No one flinched, because by now the body had earned peace, and the water, it turned brown always. A final basin of truth, a life lived in labor, now rinsed away. Sometimes herbs were added, for the scent, for the soul. Rosemary, thyme, sage, whatever the earth had given, now returned to the skin. The clean cloth, the one saved for years in a wooden box, was used now. Not for weddings, not for feast days, but for this. Tio wrapped the body, to hold it gently, to send it back to the ground with dignity. People didn't cry loudly. Not always. They cried with their hands, with the way they folded the blanket just right, with the way they tucked in the edges. They placed coins if they had them, tied a ribbon in the hair if they could, placed a small token, a carved spoon, a piece of lace, a sprig of dried lavender in the hands of the dead. The room was swept, the fire kept low, the animals silenced, because this was a ritual. And in ritual, everything was sacred. Children watched quietly, some for the first time, some too young to understand, but old enough to feel that something was being done right. And when the body was carried out, they followed, not in grand procession, just in soft footsteps, boots in mud, eyes to the earth. The grave was dug with hands that had once clasped the dead ones. The soil was damp. The coffin, if there was one, was rough. Often there was none. Just a shroud, just earth, just sky, but the body was clean, because that mattered. It meant the person had been seen, had been held, had been remembered as more than their labor. And when the last handful of soil fell, and the wind passed over the grass, those who stood nearby didn't say much, just, she's at rest now, he's clean now, and that meant more than most blessings, because in a world where washing was rare, and warmth was rationed, and privacy was a dream to be bathed, wrapped, and laid to rest with tenderness, was the most anyone could ask, and that brings us to the next chapter, where the living, despite it all, found joy, where laughter rose up, muddy and real, from within the filth, because even under layers of grime and grief, they remembered how to smile. The floors were dirt, the beds were straw, the soup was thin, and the winters were long. But somehow they laughed, not always loudly, not always in groups. But laughter lived among them, stubborn and surprising, like a flower growing. Through a crack in stone dot, a tea came in the least likely places dot in the field, as someone slipped in the mud and stood up grinning, caked and triumphant. By the fire, as two children giggled over a potato shaped like a face. In the shadows of the barn, where someone mimicked the village priest with a lump of bread for a nose, even when their skin itched from lice, even when their bellies groaned, even when the rain leaked through the thatch and the chickens refused. To lay, they found something to laugh at, because laughter wasn't a reward. It was a resistance, a way to say, "You haven't broken me yet." Not hunger, not shame, not the endless sameness of the days. They joked about themselves, about how long it had been since anyone bathed, about the smell in the outhouse, about the one pair of shoes passed between three brothers. They teased their elders carefully, and their elders teased back with sharper wit and slower smiles. A girl would roll her eyes as her mother sniffed a shirt and said, "Still good for church." A boy would wrinkle his nose at the soup and ask, "Was this yesterday's dinner?" Or last week's. The laughter was often quiet, soft chuckles, crooked smiles. But once in a while, it cracked the air like a fire suddenly catching. A whole room bursting into cackles over a spilled bucket or a rooster that wouldn't shut up during prayer. There was joy in their survival. Joy in the fact that despite the filth, despite the fear, they were still there, still breathing, still waking, still sharing stew from the same chipped bowl. They didn't need holidays for laughter. Every day that didn't bring death was reason enough, and sometimes they laughed during the hardest moments. Dotty funerals, after storms, in the middle of sickness, not because they were cruel, but because grief sharpened the humor, because tears and giggles often came from the same well. They knew the absurdity of life. How one day a man could step in dung, fall flat, and become a story passed on for months. How a goat could escape, chase the priest, and be forever known as Saint Billy. The stories grew like moss, exaggerated, embellished, shared at dusk, when the children were almost asleep and the fire cast shadows on the ceiling. Laughter made them feel human again, made them feel more than mud and hunger and toil, even when their hands were cracked, even when their clothes hung loose from thin shoulders. They laughed at the stink of their own boots, at the impossible tangle of their hair, at lice races on the edge of a bed frame, because if they didn't, what else was left? There was no shame in it, no guilt in the joy. It didn't mean they weren't suffering. It meant they still remembered what it was like not to. Children were the loudest. Their laughter bounced off walls, spilled into the yard, ran faster than their feet, but the old ones laughed too, their shoulders shaking in silence, eyes crinkling at jokes told 100 times, finding new joy in old phrases, even a simple act, a burp at the wrong moment, a fart during grace could split the room in two, and no one stayed angry. Not for long, because laughter was forgiveness. It smoothed over sharp words, filled the cracks where sorrow might creep in, and in those moments muddy. Real you saw who they were, not victims, not shadows beneath history, but people who got through it however they could. And sometimes often that meant laughing until their sides ached, until the tears came, until they could breathe again, because the filth was heavy. But laughter made it lighter, and that brings us to the end, where all the dirt and the dignity, the aching, and the effort are remembered not for how low they were, but for how hard they tried to rise, even if it was just for a smile. Even if it was just to feel human, for one more day. No one wrote their names in books. No one painted their portraits or stitched their stories into tapestries. They lived. They worked. They washed when they could and when they couldn't. They carried the dirt with dignity, because in the end, medieval hygiene wasn't about purity. It wasn't about perfection. It was about persistence, a basin of cold water, a lice-stung cloth, a mother spitting into her palm to wipe soot from her child's face, a man scraping earth from beneath his nails not for pride, but for peace. These weren't grand acts. They weren't revolutions. But they were quiet rebellions against a world that made everything difficult, including the simple act of feeling. Clean, there is a kind of beauty in that struggle. In hands rubbed raw from hauling water, in arms sore from lifting buckets, in backs bent over the same washboard again and again, and still they tried, not because they believed it would change everything, but because it changed something, a moment, a feeling, a breath of warmth in a cold, unyielding life. We think of dirt now as the enemy. We sterilize, we scrub, we sanitize. But they lived in a world where dirt was part of everything. In the walls, in the bread, in the lungs, and still they believed in washing. They believed in cloths soaked with vinegar and thyme, in water left out overnight to settle, in rain that fell just right so someone might rinse the weight of the week from their shoulders. They believed in cleaning babies with straw, in brushing teeth with ash, in packing wounds with mud that cooled faster than grief. And when death came, as it always did, they washed their dead. Not because it fixed anything, but because it said, "You mattered." There's a kind of poetry in that dot, in cleaning a body not for life, but for the memory of it, for the story it carried, for the hands that once carried others. We picture peasants, covered in filth. And they were, but not for lack of trying. They scraped, they scrubbed, they softened what they could, and still they laughed. Still they married. Still they held children close to their chests, pressing their faces into the scent of work and smoke and stubborn love. Their lives weren't clean, but they were sacred, a cracked bar of soap, a basin of rainwater, a single towel hung beside the fire. These were relics in their own way, symbols of survival, of care, of defiance, because when the world gave them mud, they made it into medicine. When the world gave them rot, they found ways to rise. And when the world gave them nothing, they kept washing anyway. So tonight, as you rest, as your blanket warms, your shoulders and your breath slows with sleep, remember them, not as dirty, not as primitive, but as people with hands that blistered, with backs that broke, with hearts that never stopped reaching for something softer, even if that softness came only in steam, in a cloth, in a cup of water warmed by fire. Their history wasn't written with ink. It was written in sweat, in ash, in the rinse of cold water over tired feet. And if you listen, really listen, you can almost hear it, the splash of a bucket on stone, the creak of wood soaked too many times, the hum of someone singing while scrubbing the floor, the laughter that slipped out even with soap in the eyes. It's all still here, carried forward, held in memory, and maybe tonight held in your dreams. So rest now. Let the stories settle. Let the warmth gather. Let your breath slow with theirs, because even centuries later, there is still a quiet dignity in dirty hands that tried to come clean.